I'm mad because the NIL collective has a bigger role in recruiting the nation's top quarterback than the head football coach.
Woo-wee, Coach Carl Reed is mad, but I am so happy to be here for a Monday edition of College Football Today. We have some great guests joining us in a bit for today's deadline to declare for the NFL Draft. But before we get there, Carl, we got to talk a little bit more about this Jaden Rashada situation. Some backstory here. He did miss the deadline to enroll for the spring semester on Friday, which means he will not be able to participate in spring ball unless, of course, he gets an exemption. He has not been released from his letter of intent, though, so he's still signed with the Gators. And as you referenced, all of this reportedly stemming from an issue with an NIL deal. So in your estimation, Coach Carl Reed, how should this have gone down?
This should go down with Billy Napier having control because Billy Napier is the head football coach at the University of Florida. I'm hearing road boosters. I'm hearing the collective led by Eddie Rojas at the University of Florida, the Florida Gator Collective. But what I'm not hearing enough of is Billy Napier drawing a line in the sand and saying, this is what exactly needs to happen. You signed a letter of intent. Now, what that means is that Billy Napier still holds the card because he doesn't have to let the kid go. That's really a decision that's up to him. But I don't care how much money is involved, but you are the head football coach at the University of Florida, and you alone should be determining how the program is going to go and how it's going to be run. We're having too much outside influences from people who put mess in the game, and it's causing a major, major issue at the University of Florida.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about this today when we were, meeting about it and wanted to discuss, on this show. And I, for one, am a little, perplexed that it's gone to this length. It was something that we knew was going to be a factor when NIL, came into the picture, and that you'd have to work with these collectives. I mean, I think that the name is perfect and collective, and that who's the one that holds all the cards and who's the one that has the most control over this. But you're saying that it should just be up to the head ball coach? I mean, you have to work with it to a certain extent, right? It's a necessary evil.
One of the issues that we're having here is that when this name, image, and likeness deal was started, I'm a guy that's all for it. Players should be able to make money based on their name, image, and likeness. But when the collective started getting built, it has turned into a pay-for-play situation. And it has brought in an outside party called the collective, and that is what is becoming an issue. You got a kid, I don't know whether the number is 6 million or I don't know whether the number is 13 million. Different numbers have been thrown around. But what I will say is 6 million to a kid who hasn't thrown a touchdown pass in college is a preposterous number. You've got proven guys coming in the transfer portal. You got a guy like Walker Russell that's available now from LSU. I'm not going to give a kid that hasn't thrown a touchdown pass that type of money. You want $6 million? I'll give it to you after you throw your 30th touchdown passes. And the Gators are in Atlanta in the SEC championship game.
I get a little bit, though, of the desperation that's coming from Billy Napier, and that you look at that quarterback room. You talked about some guys that are still available, but when you look at the guys that are planning on suiting up for the Gators next year, I mean, Graham Mertz, a few years at Wisconsin, still not sure what necessarily he's capable of. We saw Jack Miller in the Las Vegas Bowl, left definitely something to be desired, only putting up 3 total points in that game. So do you understand maybe a little bit of why they're doing kind of whatever it takes to make sure that you get a 5-star talent like Jaden Rashada on campus?
A legendary coach named Smokey Gaines, who used to be an assistant for Dick Vitale at the University of Detroit, told me at a hotel room in Memphis years ago, Coach, that if you pay him, you can't coach him. And now you're in a situation where this has went past what name, image, and likeness is supposed to be. You have a kid almost treating this like an NFL hold off. So now, even if you bring them in after caving to the money, it's going to be extremely hard to coach them. And coaches need to keep that in mind, because you don't just have the quarterback position. You have an entire locker room of guys. What's next? A guy with 3 sacks is going to want to get paid more than a 3rd-round pick in the NFL draft? What are we talking about here? Production has to matter at some point.
And we will talk about that as it pertains to today's deadline for the NFL draft in just a little bit. But let's move on to another big story today. Some news out of Fort Worth. TCU in the market for a new offensive coordinator following Garrett Riley's departure for Clemson. And it looks like Arkansas offensive coordinator Kendall Briles, now the leading candidate to become the next OC. Understandably, TCU fans a little perplexed, maybe not so happy about this. I think anybody with the last name Briles, they're of course scratching their heads a bit. But Carl, what's your take on this situation?
It's a move that makes a lot of sense from a football standpoint from TCU. Kendall Briles has been very good as an offensive coordinator during his time in the SEC. Prior to that, he was with Lane Kiffin at FAU, and he knows the state of Texas from all the years of being at Baylor and being a guy that's a homegrown Texas kid. TCU right now is at the point where they want to win national championships. They got a taste. They got blown out bad against Georgia, but they have a taste now in their mouth of what the big time looks like. And when guys start feeling and chasing the big time, who the guy is as a coach becomes more important a lot of times than who people think he is as a person.
Yeah, and there's, a lot of murkiness with his involvement with everything that went down at Baylor. Obviously, his dad, though, is Art Briles, and so that comes with it. There's always been a feud between, Baylor and TCU back when Gary Patterson was there, and so there's just kind of a little bit of animosity there among Horned Frog fans. But I'm curious from, Briles' standpoint. He just signed an extension for $1.3 million. He had some interest from Miami, from Mississippi State. What's in it for him to go to TCU outside of the obvious fact that they were just playing for a national championship?
You get to go back home to the state of Texas, which you're very pleased with. Also, it depends on the kind of package they come. I'm sure they would have to beat Arkansas's financial package. Money talks in college football, and nonsense runs a marathon.
We got to end on that. I have nothing more to add there because that is just perfect. Speaking of money, though, we will be talking about it a lot in this next segment here. But, Carl, we need more than just me and you to talk about it here. So let's bring in our CBS Sports NFL draft analyst, Ryan Wilson, and Blake Brockermeyer, former offensive tackle for Texas. And more importantly, as it pertains to this conversation, Blake, you were a former first-round draft pick, so you have a great perspective when it comes to the huge decision that these kids are making right now. The deadline, technically, though, is for tonight at midnight, so there is still some time, still some question marks. But let's talk first about the players who are returning to college football. You see a quick list here. These are players that you loved to watch play for the last few years in the game. But let's start with Blake Corum here. And Ryan, left me scratching my head a little bit because you talk about the running back position, put up over 1,400 yards, 18 touchdowns. Tread on the tires is a common phrase that gets thrown out when it comes to running backs. How surprising was Corum's declaration to stay in college football?
Right. So Coach Carl talked about it, and you mentioned as well, Emily. The NIL money obviously has a lot to do with this. The injury that Blake Corum suffered late in the season against Illinois wasn't able to help down the stretch. You would imagine that also played a role. But the bigger issue is this. The running back class isn't necessarily that deep after you go Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs. And then on day two, rounds 2 and 3, you would expect there would be a run on some of these running backs that we typically see going around 2 that are immediate contributors. So that's where you sort of slotted Blake Corum to go. So while if this had been prior to this year, prior to the NIL evolution, I would have been a little more surprised because, as you know, the tread on the tires is real for running backs in college, much more so than any other position because there's only so many miles on that odometer before it becomes what feels like a limit. But Blake Corum was so incredibly important to what this Michigan team did because they did so much of their damage on the ground that on one hand, I get the notion to go back to school with the NIL tie-ins, but you do wonder if there's going to be more money left on the table that he may have been able to get through that first rookie contract had he decided to come out this year.
Well, I think Blake Corum also has a chance to be one of the Heisman contenders going into next season. He was putting up incredible numbers last year, has a lot of explosiveness. His knee injury is not a serious knee injury. It's a meniscus. So I think he has a chance to really elevate himself, move up the draft a little bit. I don't think he's going to be a first-round pick by any means, just more so of his size. But I think he could easily play himself into the second round next year and possibly win a Heisman Trophy if he can expand off what he did last year.
I think when you look at a guy like Blake Corum, and in addition to having wear and tear on you, what if you get injured again? And I know you got some NIL money. Another thing, when I look at running backs and guys in the NFL, it puts you back another year when you're trying to get your new contracts and you end up being older and older. So now you lose another bite at the apple. If you come out now, you got a 3-year deal, then you get a bite at the apple, and hopefully you get another one and another 3 years to re-up for another contract. And so staying an extra year in college sometimes, it shortens that window for you and how much money that you can make. And it exposes you to injury.
Yeah, I mean, every guy that we're going to talk about on this show today, they have their own individual situations, right? And when I look at his in particular, I think that there's a lot of risk involved, right? We talked about coming off the injury, the tread on the tires, the fact that you're risking not being able to do what you did this year. Again, 1,400 yards, especially when you have a guy like Donovan Edwards that towards the end of the season you were sharing carries with. But what I think is risky too is who's this head coach going to be potentially? You know, there's question marks when it comes to Jim Harbaugh coming back, and there's question marks with the offensive line that just won, back-to-back #1 offensive line in college football. And so I feel like you have to kind of weigh the risk versus the reward. And Blake, I want to go back to you here because you said he can easily play himself into a potential second-round pick. How easy is it, though?
I mean, nothing's easy to be a second-round pick. I mean, that's tough for any position. But I do think he will help himself by coming back, having another season, proving that he can do this multiple years, proving that he can stay healthy. Like I said, his injury is nothing severe. And he's going to be a featured back. Him and Donovan Edwards are a nice 1-2 punch. Michigan's going to run the football no matter who their head coach is. And I think it's a great decision by him to come back because I do think that he can help himself. And I do think that he has a chance to go into the season as one of the Heisman contenders, at least to start the season out.
A lot of good running backs in college football this year. But I want to switch to the other side of the ball and Jared Verse, another guy that maybe we thought could, declare for the NFL draft. Ryan, you actually had him as a top 10 pick in a mock draft. How surprising was this decision to stick around for another year at Florida State?
No, Emily, this got my attention for sure. And if you saw transfer from Albany, you saw the beginning of the season against that LSU game where he was absolutely unblockable, play after play after play. And that's how he got on a lot of people's radar early who didn't know about him, and understandably so, unless you watched a lot of Albany football. He suffered a knee injury, came back from that, wasn't quite as explosive, but is one of those knee injuries where you're not concerned long term. And again, I don't know the behind the scenes. I haven't heard the details of why he decided to return to Florida State. Pretty sure NIL probably had something to do with it, especially if he had been in the top 20th conversation when it comes to the NFL draft. This Edwards class is good. It's not necessarily blow your hair back awesome after you get past the first few picks, which meant an opportunity for Jared Verse to hear his name called earlier than perhaps in other years. But again, he made the decision to come back. If this had been pre-NIL, it would have been a huge surprise. I was only mildly surprised, but I think it opens the door for other players, people like Nolan Smith, for example, who has declared out of Georgia, missed much of the season with a pec injury. He now has an opportunity to slip into the first round, perhaps the last 10 picks or so, whereas that could have been a spot Jared Verse ended up going. And again, and Coach Carl talked about this with Blake Corum, the injuries are the real concern here because the knee injury perhaps set Verse back a little bit over the course of this season. He was explosive when he came back, not nearly as explosive as he was pre-knee injury. And again, he'll be fine at the end of the day. But it was a curious decision and one that I was mildly surprised by. But again, I get why these young people sometimes decide to return to school in this NIL world we live in.
Well, I can tell you guys what. I found Jared Verse last year in the transfer portal when we were going through guys and evaluating and putting our rankings together coming out of the University of Albany, and he was a little-known guy. I think it's important for people to understand his mentality and the kind of family he comes from. Great family, great parents. And when he was at Albany, the only thing they were worried about is his education. So a year later, he gets to go to Florida State and blows up in the transfer portal, and now he's seen as a first-round draft pick. I'm not surprised by this move at all because education is very important to his family. He's always been a high-level academic student, so they're going to feel like the money wasn't guaranteed anyway. He wasn't a top recruit, and his life has changed tremendously. I was a little surprised because all the blue chip agencies were coming after this guy. Everything pointed to him being in the first round, but he's grounded in a different way with the kind of family he has. So in the end, I wasn't surprised that this is the decision they made. He'll leave Florida State not only with a first-round grade if he can continue to stay healthy, but he'll leave with his degree in hand, and I know that's important to his mom.
Yeah, we've mentioned NIL is a big factor in all of this, but before NIL, the main factor really was development, right? They're not quite ready to leave. They need another year under their belt. Jared Verse is a guy obviously tore up, his first season at the FBS level, but the fact that his development has gotten so much better year after year. Again, he started at Albany. He was not recruited whatsoever. He was a tight end out of high school, gained a ton of weight, moved to defensive end, and it's been absolutely spectacular. And so I'm excited to see what another year, too, what he could possibly do. And so Jared Verse, sticking with college football. Selfishly, as a college football fan, definitely excited about that. But Ryan, I'm excited to see where you have him projected next year. Could propel himself even higher. What he had, number 9, right? Is that about what you were projecting?
Yeah, he was top 15 regularly for sure. He was that good. So
there's not that much higher to go, but we'll see what happens with him there. Now, Blake, your expertise is, of course, on the offensive line. So I got to ask about a guy that, again, these are all kind of, question marks as could they have gone? Could they have stayed? But Olu Fashanu at Penn State has decided to stick around and play another year of college football at least. And Carl, you mentioned the academic side of things. This is a factor when it comes to his decision-making in this. Blake, how surprising was this move to stick around in college football for Olu Fashanu?
It's very surprising because he's projected to go 10 to 15 in the first round. He's a really young prospect. I think he's 19 years old. He's got a ton of room for development. He would be a huge get for any NFL team to kind of build around their offensive line. Very athletic player. The sky is the limit for him. And to be ranked that high and to possibly be the first or second offensive tackle picked in the draft, you almost never see guys come back to school when they're that high. So that's a big surprise for me. I think he's making a mistake by going back to school. He'll have insurance to cover him and all that kind of stuff. But you're really honestly not going to get picked much higher than he was projected to go right now. But he must love the college experience and the college life, and good for him. Peyton Manning did the same thing going back to Tennessee as last year, and some kids just love the experience and want to get their degree. But if that was me personally, I would have left for the draft and gone back to school later.
Yeah, I'm with you, Blake. I would have been running to the draft, but that's probably because I'm not nearly as smart as Olu Fashanu is, and I think that's maybe one of the takeaways. And another thing, and Coach Carl talked about this, and I think this is important. I talked to David Ajabo last year at the Combine, and he came over from Nigeria, spent time in Scotland, interestingly enough, and he said, my parents don't even care about football. They sent me over to the United States to get an education. And I feel like that's sort of a recurring theme with some of these players who are incredibly smart. And we know that secondhand because we know them primarily as football players. But I'm with you. Like, Fashanu was a special player, only played for 1 year, didn't see the field a lot before this season. And he was, for the most part, absolutely dominant, which gets your attention, no doubt. And I think it's interesting because as we sit here right now, the Bears sort of fell their way into the number 1 overall pick with how Week 18 played out in the NFL regular season finale. And they're going to try to trade out of that pick. And they're going to be teams looking for quarterbacks. But part of me wonders if Olu Fashanu had stayed in the draft, had declared for the draft, if the Bears would give serious consideration to taking him there. Because the first thing they have to fix is protecting Justin Fields. And now they can trade down and get picks and do whatever they need to do. But there's not an offensive lineman, in my mind, who has as much upside, as much athleticism, and as much of a chance to be a blue-chip left tackle that you can leave out there for 10 years as Olu Fashanu. So the good news is he's going back, and he'll be that same guy next year. Fingers crossed he stays healthy. But I was like you, Blake. I was surprised that he decided to return to school. I get all the academic stuff and loving college and all that stuff. But when you're talking about top 5 money, that's life-changing money for you, your kids, and their kids. And you can keep going down the line if he had decided to, in fact, come out.
And fully guaranteed. So his entire contract would have been fully guaranteed. So it's a big risk on his part, but hopefully he'll stay healthy and he'll come back next year even a better player and be picked relatively the same age. Next year they've got a lot of good quarterbacks coming out. So as good a player as he is, he's probably going to fall more than he wants to, just because at the top of the draft there's going to be multiple quarterbacks getting picked off.
It's hard to turn away from being the first offensive lineman taken in the draft and possibly the first player. I got a whole rule that says if I'm going in the first round, I'm leaving town. But if I'm going late, I'm going to go back to school with my homecoming date.
I love that. That needs to be a t-shirt, Carl. So this is a guy that potentially #1 overall pick. We've mentioned all the different factors that could have potentially contributed to that, but I want to go back on what Blake said. And Carl, get your opinion on this. How much these guys actually look at who else is entering the draft that year, not just from their position, but need when it comes to the quarterback position and how you figure out where you might factor in that first round talent. What are some things that go into these difficult decisions that these guys are having to make? Carl?
I think that the first thing that a lot of them are going to look at is draft positioning. And then when you're going back to school, a lot of those guys are tired of going to class and tired of being students also. So I think that weighs into it, how well that they've done academically and where they're at, so to speak, in terms of class and how far they are away from their degree. In addition to that, what type of advisement they're getting. Who is their agent? Are they getting information from a reputable source? And like Blake mentioned earlier, an offensive lineman might be a high pick today, but next year you can be bombarded with quarterbacks in the draft, and that makes you slip even though your game didn't slip. So you have to think all of those things through, and I think all of those factors are important in the decision.
The only factor that matters is where you're projected to go in the draft. I mean, if you're projected to go in the top 10 or 15 in the draft, you need to go to the draft. I mean, there's no doubt about it. The education can always come back and get your degree. You see it time and time again in all the sports where guys come back, even decades later come back and get a degree. So the time is now. He's a young player. He's 19 years old. He can make a fortune in the NFL if he stays healthy and play for a long time. But obviously for him, he's got different reasoning, and good for him for sticking with his guns and doing what he wants to do.
Blake, real quick, you mentioned Peyton Manning, and I love that comparison because obviously that was a very long time ago in the late 90s, and there's so many other considerations and factors that you got to think about nowadays. How much do you think, we've mentioned NIL, but also just the opportunity out there when it comes to transfer portal, how much does that weigh into those decisions? Because guys could say, it's not working out, the team that I'm in, but I'm not quite ready. I haven't put enough on tape to make the jump to the NFL. I'll just go somewhere else that fits me. How much does that factor in, do you think, nowadays versus, what Peyton Manning was thinking about back in the late 90s?
Well, I think it can factor into it. I mean, you see it, you've already seen it multiple times this last season, guys transferring from one school to another school, basically for opportunity to get more exposure and for money. I mean, the facts are the facts. I think you're going to see more of that. You're going to see more young players that play, especially at smaller schools, that are excellent players that put good film out there, enter the portal, go to bigger schools, get paid more money. I mean, that's just going to be the future of college athletics, not only in football, but in other sports. So I think that does play a factor. And then obviously, just with the high school recruiting, especially for a quarterback, these guys are getting paid, like we talked about earlier in the episode, millions of dollars for guys that have never thrown one pass, which is crazy, but good for them for getting what they can get. So the game has changed. You have to evolve, or you're going to get left behind, and you have to recruit your roster every single year, because if you're at a smaller school that's not in the limelight, not a big time program, there's a good chance that your players are getting tampered with a lot more than you maybe think that they are.
All right, well, today is, of course, all about declaring for the draft. So let's show you the guys who are headed to the NFL. Jordan Addison, Will Anderson, Kayshon Boutte. But I want to go to the guy fourth on this list here, and Bryan Bresee. Blake, this is another player that you really like. We'll get your take on him in a bit, but we got to ask our NFL draft analyst first. What's the market for this guy? Where do you project him to go, Ryan?
So that's a great question, Emily, because there are mixed opinions, and you have to take this with the qualifier that Bryan Bresee had a lot of things in the off-field happen to him His sister passed away, which is obviously horrible news. He had the ACL injury last season, which affected his ability to come back this year and be the dominant guy he is. So all those things taken under advisement, of course, and he could be like an early round 2 guy. He could be a top 15 guy, depending on which Bryan Bresee you think you're getting as an NFL team. And by all accounts, he's a great young man, and there's no concerns about any of the off-field issues. It's just a matter of if you're taking him top 10, there are very few guys that look like him physically and can do the things when he's laser focused and making plays that he does play in and play out. The issue is sometimes he goes missing for a series or 2 or 3, and you wonder, okay, which guy am I getting if I'm drafting 12th or 13th overall or wherever you're looking for an interior defensive lineman, and how is that going to play out? Now, one of the other issues you have to consider, and this is the thing that makes trying to figure this out so difficult, you have to consider the situation he's going to in the NFL. The coaching staff is in place. What do they think they can get out of him? And those are all the variables that have to go into this sort of math equation to determine where he ends up going. I didn't love Bryan Bresee's tape for 2022. I understand all the mitigating factors, and I'm willing to, on some level, let that be part of my evaluation. But right now I have him as a late 1, early 2, with the understanding that if he flips the switch, he could be a top 15 guy all day long.
Yeah, I think the big concern with Bryan Bresee is he's missed 13 games in the last 2 seasons. He's got a history of injuries. I think playing over the center for the majority of the snaps at center probably didn't help him either. I think he's more of a three technique at the next level. So I think that could help him getting in a natural position where he can kind of play on the edge a little bit more. He excels in movement. And Clemson moves their defensive linemen around a lot. The one thing that you saw with him in high school is he was just an elite pass rusher. You would see him dominate every single camp that he went to, and you just didn't see that at Clemson. You didn't see him sacking the quarterback like I thought he would coming out of high school. So I think if he gets to the right spot with a team that needs a 3 technique, then I think he could probably really excel in that situation. But if you're going to put him at as a shade or a 2-eye at the next level, I think he's going to have a problem eating up blocks because that's not really his game.
Yeah, 6'5", 305. We've also seen some Clemson defensive linemen have success in the NFL, so certainly take that into consideration. They have blazed the trail for him. Let's go to quarterbacks, guys. We're saving the best for last year. A lot of great quarterbacks entering the league, and I mean, I can't even go any further. I have to start with Will Levis. Today, our friend Ryan, who's on the show, had him mocked number 1 overall. Some trading involved in there, of course, Ryan, but just straight up, what is your reasoning behind Will Levis taken first in April's draft?
Emily, you sound like several folks on Twitter who were not happy about
I'm not the only one that has to be asking this question, Ryan.
You are not. That's right. So I had the Colts trading up to get Will Levis. And full disclosure, if I'm ranking my quarterbacks, it's Bryce Young, C.J. Stroud, and then Will Levis third, all going in the first round. And Anthony Richardson's in that conversation as well. So why is Will Levis going first in this latest mock draft that I did? Number 1, I don't know what Jim Irsay's thinking because no one seems to know what he's thinking. And if it feels like he falls in love with a quarterback, whomever it may be, he's going to go get that quarterback, whatever the cost. It's obvious that the free agent market hasn't worked long-term in that post-Andrew Luck world in Indianapolis at the quarterback position. So it may be a situation where they're going to overpay if it happens to cost that to go get their quarterback. I'm not sure if they like Will Levis or not, but I will tell you this. There are several NFL teams that are high on Will Levis, much higher than fans and media folks are, because fans and media folks ended up watching the 2022 season, and that raised a ton of question marks. And what I'm routinely told when I talk to scouts and folks around the league is, please go watch 2021. Understand that the offensive line wasn't very good at Kentucky, that the wide receivers were freshmen, that Chris Rodriguez was out the first 4 games of the season in the backfield. And, of course, we know that Will Levis was injured for most of the season, toe and shoulder. So all those things are complicating factors when you try to do this evaluation. And look, I get it. I get that he has the body type that you're looking for. I get that he has the arm strength. I get that he's actually really athletic, although it was hard to tell at times because of those injuries in 2022. I just don't know if I have a top 5 pick, if I'm going to go all in chips-wise with Will Levis. Now, there are questions about Bryce Young and C.J. Stroud too, of course, but that's the reasoning why I had Will Levis go that high, because the craziness factor when it comes to Jim Irsay, and NFL teams like Levis better than fans and some media folk.
Ryan, when you put Will Levis over Bryce Young, I was tweeting you from my burner account. I was one of those fans going crazy at you. I think Bryce Young has to be QB1 in this group. The way he throws the ball, the way he handles the pocket, he's already shown that he can run an NFL-style offense, and he's made just huge throws, looks flawless and polished at the quarterback position. I think that I will go with Bryce Young. If I was in that position, one thing that you did say, though, when Jim Irsay likes a quarterback, you bring up an incredible point. He does go all in and go after him, and maybe their quarterback of the future, they feel like is in this draft, but I will go with Bryce Young.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that, in my opinion, that Bryce Young's the number one quarterback by a long shot. I would take him with the first pick, if not the Bears, obviously, but whoever's going to pick first that needs a quarterback. He's an elite processor, make every throw on the field. And just an incredible player that can do it all. His only knock is his size. He is a smaller frame guy, but so is Kyler Murray, and he can do the same thing. So he's my number one player in the draft, and I think you'd be making a big mistake taking Will Levis over Bryce Young.
Agreed. And Ryan, I have to give you the benefit of the doubt here, though. Although I'm not the only one asking about why is Will Levis, mocked this high, you're also not the only one mocking him that high. So there's clearly some fascination and some excitement from NFL personnel about what he's capable of. The body size, the fact that he has played in an NFL-type system, was really successful back in 2021 under, offensive coordinator Liam Cohen. And so there is definitely some examples for why he could find some success. But another guy that I want to ask about, too, in terms of the upside, I think is the common word that we use when we talk about Anthony Richardson, because you see these little sparks, right? You see what happened in the opening game of last season when they played Utah. Absolutely spectacular. Then, of course, dropped off a little bit. Also, against Tennessee, he put up some great tape there. What are NFL personnel saying about him, Ryan?
Yeah, you're hitting the highlights, and that's exactly it. Like, I'm a huge Anthony Richardson fan, and I'll just say this, Emily. If Bryce Young were in Anthony Richardson's body, we would have zero conversations about any concerns about Bryce Young. Ooh. And that's the only knock, as Blake and Coach Carl mentioned. But NFL teams are worried about the lack of experience, and that's the reality. And it's one of those things where you sort of wish selfishly that Richardson had returned to college for another year, because coming into the 2022 season, he had only attempted, I believe, 68 passes, sharing time with Emory Jones a couple seasons ago. And you talk about that Utah game where he looked like the best player on planet Earth. And then over the course of the season, there were some games where you're like, oh, my God, this young man's been playing football for 2 weeks. Like, I don't know what's going on here. And those wild fluctuations is what scares NFL teams. Mm-hmm. And that's just the reality of it. Now, I think best case scenario for Richardson, and, this isn't any sort of grand proclamation, but you go to a situation where things are good, not terrible. And by that, I mean, Brock Purdy in San Francisco turned out to be a pretty good situation for Brock Purdy. He was the last player selected. So if you're in the first round and you're picking towards the bottom half of the first round and Anthony Richardson's still there and you think you have an opportunity to groom this young man and not throw him out there right away, that's best case scenario. I think that makes sense. So we'll see how it unfolds. I love this young man. I love the physicality he brings, his ability to win with his legs, and obviously his arm strength. But he does need more reps, and that's what NFL teams are going to have to take under consideration when they decide to make the pick on him.
I love that
what
you mentioned.
What scares me about Anthony Richardson is the lack of consistency in passing the football. And time again in the National Football League, we see these guys that played in college, and they're great dual threat guys. They make extreme plays running the ball. They throw well on the run, evading the pocket. But in the National Football League, it has been proven time and time again that to play quarterback at a high level, you have to be able to consistently throw the ball from the pocket and make reads in the progression. And I have not seen him consistently do that. And any quarterback that has not been able to make that transition has struggled in that league, because the ability to run around in the National Football League isn't available to you the same way it is in college.
Yeah, you said you haven't seen enough of Anthony Richardson. You've seen a lot of a guy like Stetson Bennett, yet you don't know what the heck to do with him. He is a huge question mark when it comes to what his market's going to look like in the NFL, how you evaluate him. He has all the intangibles. He has the leadership quality. He has the national championships. And yet, What is Stetson Bennett in the NFL? Ryan, you mentioned the Brock Purdy comparison, I think a lot, not to Stetson Bennett, but just in general, of a guy that can fit so well in a system like what Kyle Shanahan has created for him. Do you see, if there is a situation similar to what we saw from Brock Purdy, if there is a situation like that for Stetson Bennett? Here's a great graphic comparing the two of them. Do you see Stetson Bennett having a Brock Purdy-like year in an NFL system?
Yeah, this is pretty easy. All that has to happen is that the 49ers need to draft Stetson Bennett, and he will be fine. Because that feels like best case scenario. You're getting the best play caller on planet Earth in Kyle Shanahan. You're getting all those weapons around you, and you get the benefit of playing on a great defense. It sounds a lot like playing at Georgia, right? But Stetson Bennett's 25 years old. We all know the stats. He's been around forever. He's the same size as Bryce Young. The difference is athletically, he doesn't do the same things Bryce Young does. But he's a good athlete. He can run with the football. Brock Purdy's bigger, has a better arm, probably just as athletic, maybe doesn't run quite as well as Stetson Bennett, but it's close. So I think there's a situation where Stetson probably gets drafted late on day 3 in the 7th round. He's going to be a leader from Jump Street. He's incredibly smart. He'll know the offense. He can run the scout team for you. And if there's a situation where he needs to be forced into action, and you see it every year in the NFL where second-team quarterbacks, sometimes third-team quarterbacks have to take the field, play for a game, maybe 3 or 4 games. If Taylor Heineke can have success in the NFL, and a lot of credit to him for what he's able to accomplish, certainly Stetson Bennett can have that type of role. But he's not a guy you're drafting in the 2nd or 3rd round with the expectation that he'll be a starter in 2 or 3 years. That's just not his game. That's just not where he's at. But I think there's a place on an NFL roster for Stetson Bennett who can do a lot of things, from the cerebral side to helping your teammates prepare to break in case of emergency. Put him out there, and he can potentially keep you in a ball game and help you win 2 or 3 or 4 games while your starter gets healthy.
Ryan, is he drafted? Real quick.
Yeah, I think he goes late 7th, goes in the 7th, late into the day 3. I think there's an opportunity for him to get drafted there.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if Tyler Huntley, Skylar Thompson, and Brock Purdy can start playoff games in the NFL, I think Stetson Bennett has a place in the NFL. This guy is the most slept-on guy in the history of college football. He's a very good player. Do I see him being a future NFL Hall of Famer? Probably not, but there's a place for him on an NFL team. You see it every year with multiple injuries. A guy like him can come in if he's in the right system. When you think of those 3 teams, the Ravens, the Dolphins, and the 49ers, what are we thinking? They're all very good teams. They all have good talent around them, and so Stetson Bennett's going to obviously need some of that to succeed, just like any quarterback does. But I think there's a place for him. I think he's a capable player, and I think that he's going to have a very long NFL future as a backup quarterback, a guy that can come in when he's needed and can come in and move the chains and win games for teams.
The key to Stetson Bennett's career is going to be, how is the team that he goes to built? Every team does not build through a franchise quarterback. We can remember the Baltimore Ravens winning the championship with Trent Dilfer, and he won't win any quarterback contest now. So I think the thing for Stetson Bennett, can you go to an organization that's built around defense, the run game, and the quarterback not losing you the game? There is a home for Stetson Bennett somewhere in the National Football League, depending on how the team is constructed. Now, if he can end up in one of those teams that runs an open system and he'll get an opportunity to throw the ball around a little bit, I don't know if that's necessarily the best thing for him, but we will see.
I'm excited to see, what becomes of Stetson Bennett. I feel like immediately after he won this 2nd national championship, it was like, all right, here's where the Cinderella story ends. He's not looking like an NFL quarterback, that sort of thing. But Ryan, you've seen this so many times, I'm sure, with covering the draft and seeing, it's a copycat league, right? Is that always referred to in the NFL? And when you see what happens with a Brock Purdy, that's definitely going to have a trickle-down effect. But especially with Tom Brady, and that he was such a late draft pick so many times, these NFL franchises will look at it and say, let's just take a flyer on a guy later in a round. Let's see what happens. But when you, quote-unquote, take a flyer, what are some of the most important attributes and skills that you're looking for if you're just going to take a flyer on a guy in a later round?
Yeah, that's right. And one of the things to keep in mind, Emily, and I learned this and have to remind myself each and every year, is that it is so incredibly hard to figure out who's going to be good as a quarterback, whether it's round 1 or whether it's the Mr. Irrelevant. I mean, If you told me, if you put two quarterbacks next to each other, Brock Purdy and Zach Wilson, and say which one's the first round pick, no one's picking Zach Wilson. But Zach Wilson went second overall. But what are you looking for when you draft a quarterback on day 3? First of all, you're looking for guys who's incredibly smart, who's incredibly hardworking, who's a great teammate, who understands what's being asked of him, even if it's not in terms of being a starter. Or you're looking for guys with physical tools that need just a little bit more development, and they didn't perhaps get that because they didn't play a lot. Matt Castle, for example, went to USC. He took a handful of snaps throughout his career because he's behind Carson Palmer, and he ended up going in the 7th round and had a relatively long career. So those are usually the two baskets that those people fall into. Athleticism, but short on experience, or guys who are incredibly smart, cerebral players, who in Stetson Bennett's case also has a little athleticism and a ton of experience, and who can make plays for you. Because at the end of the day, if you had all those things, you would be in the first round conversation. Didn't happen that way, so you fall to day 2, more likely day 3, and I think that's the case. And I think Blake made an important point about Stetson Bennett. He is being slept on. Again, if he were like Bryce Young in terms of being 6'2" and 220, we'd be having a different conversation right now. Unfortunately, he's not. Age is actually less of a concern for the quarterback position. He's not playing running back or defensive back. But at the end of the day, when you're 5'11"-ish, 185, 190, playing quarterback, you have to do everything at such a high level to overcome those things. And that's where you see the disparity between a Bryce Young, for example, and a Stetson Bennett.
He is a good athlete, though. I mean, Stetson Bennett can run. He can make people miss. I mean, you've seen it over and over again the last 2 seasons. I mean, I look at it this way. If Anthony Richardson had been the quarterback at Georgia, there's no way they would have won a national championship this year. You have to look at this guy is a winner. He understands how to move the chains. He understands the offense. He's a good processor. He's a good athlete. So there's a place for him. And I look forward to seeing where he ends up, because I think he's going to have a long, successful NFL career as a backup. And when he gets an opportunity to go in the games, if somebody gets hurt, he's going to make the most of it.
Carl, do you agree with that? If Anthony Richardson was the quarterback at Georgia, they would not have won college football national championship?
I think this brings up, I don't think that Stetson Bennett is going to be the reason you lose a football game. I do think if Anthony Richardson is at Georgia, he's going to take some chances that Stetson Bennett is not going to take. When I come back to the NFL evaluation, though, I would say the same thing about Stetson Bennett from an NFL standpoint that I would say about Anthony Richardson. Does he have the ability to consistently make passes from the pocket in the National Football League? And I think that's the biggest question that has to be answered. And I don't know that either quarterback consistently does that enough for them to be quality starters in the NFL.
Yeah, and Carl, when we look at, these quarterbacks that are leaving for the NFL, we look at the holes that they leave behind, right? And you go, oh my gosh, what is Ohio State going to do without C.J. Stroud? Or, what is Alabama going to do without Bryce Young? The common theme, though, is that we feel like Georgia's going to be okay beyond Stetson Bennett. I mean, what kind of hole does he leave behind?
He leaves behind a huge hole because something that we know is important, but we don't talk about it enough in football and sports, is leadership ability. And one thing that you have to say on Stetson Bennett's behalf, being a walk-on, being a guy that had to beat out 5-star guys to lead the kind of team that has the kind of alphas that they have on that Georgia defense, Georgia offense, some of the players he played with, he earned their trust. He did something in that locker room, something in that football complex that made everybody in the building trust that he was the guy to lead them. And he came away with 2 national championships. And that leadership is something that's not going to come up on a 40-yard dash. It's not going to come up on the measuring tape. But his ability to have elite leadership cannot be discounted in his pursuit for a professional football career.
Yeah, it's a big unknown, but Georgia's going to be fine. I'm assuming Carson Beck will be the starter going into next season. But it's a huge unknown on exactly what he can do. He's a very highly rated, highly touted player that's got a few reps here and there. But it's going to be the limelight's going to be a lot different on him. The pressure's going to be different with him, especially trying to three-peat. But there's a lot of talent around him. As long as they keep Todd Monken as their offensive coordinator, I think that he'll be put in a position of success. But like Carl mentioned, I mean, Stetson Bennett has been there, done it, proven it. started from the bottom, and all he did was win football games at Georgia.
And Georgia also bringing in some elite wide receiver talent in the transfer portal, so we will see what they do next season. Guys, again, today is just the deadline to declare. There could be more names that enter in the next couple of hours. Midnight Eastern time is the official cutoff, but what I will tell you is that we have a long offseason to talk about this. We have a lot of time between now and the draft, which means Ryan Wilson, we will have you back on to talk more about it, because as you know, when the combine and pro days and everything happens, so much will change, and we are excited to download all of it. Ryan, thank you so much. Blake, thank you. Carl, thank you. As a reminder, we are here every Monday and Wednesday at 5 o'clock Eastern. If you don't want to miss a moment, be sure to subscribe to the 24/7 Sports YouTube page. Enjoy your night, and we'll see you back here Wednesday.